Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Kinder Institute Forum featuring market urbanism guru Scott Beyer. I'm Bill Fulton, the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research here at Rice University. I want to welcome you all today. The Kinder Institute Forum brings thought leaders from around the world to share ideas about today's most pressing urban issues, often as they apply to our home city of Houston, which is where we are located at Rice University. The Kinder Institute Forum is made possible thanks to our friends at PNC Bank, which is the title sponsor of this lecture series. And right now, I'd like to turn it over to Judy Suddeth, Regional President of PNC Bank in Houston, to welcome everyone today. Julie.
Thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Young-Suddeth, Regional President for PNC in Houston, and I've had several opportunities to give opening remarks on these forums. And as always, it's such a privilege to be with you today. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the call as we learn more about what we can do as a community to improve the Houston metro area. Today, the Kinder Institute has invited yet another expert speaker who will give us fresh perspectives on many urban affairs topics through the lens of a free market approach. Those of you who know PNC are well aware of our commitment and dedication to the Houston community as the fourth largest bank here locally. But if you don't know us yet, what I'll share is that we are a Main Street bank, and as such, we're highly focused on making significant investments in this region's future. And we do this in a variety of ways at the local level. One of those is through supporting amazing community partners like the Kinder Institute. This forum series and the leading experts who take part in it offer a level of accessibility and top insights that you're hard-pressed to find anywhere else. Our speaker this afternoon, as Bill mentioned, journalist Scott Beyer, offers exactly that. Someone who studied and reported on and immersed himself in the topic of urban affairs and what it takes to create more livable cities. So I'm very excited to listen to what he has to say, and I'm sure you are as well. So with that, thanks for joining. I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Julie. Generous support for our programs also comes through a multi-year grant from Houston Endowment. In addition, we rely on philanthropic investments from many other contributors. Special thanks go to Nancy and Rich Kinder and the Kinder Foundation, Laura and Tom Bacon, the Baxter Trust, Chevron, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the JP Morgan Chase Foundation, Wells Fargo, the William T. Grant Foundation, Bank of America, as I said, PNC Bank, the Spencer Foundation, Claire and Eric Anya, Arnold Ventures, Bracewell, Centerpoint Energy, Catherine and Hank Coleman, HEB, Sis and Hasty Johnson, Becky and Ralph O'Connor, the United Way of Greater Houston, Willie Nanayakahara and Associates, and many, many others. I want to introduce Scott Beyer now. As Julie said, Scott has studied cities both here in the U.S. and elsewhere very closely, and has spent a lot of time understanding Houston. I think much better than most other people who study urban affairs. So we're thrilled to have you here today, Scott. Scott owns and manages Market Urbanism Report, a media company that advances free market city policy, and he owns a spin-off consulting firm, Beyer Policy, that tries to make these reforms a political reality. He is an urban affairs journalist who writes regular columns for Forbes, Governing Magazine, and HousingOnline.com. So Scott, welcome, and thank you for being with us today, and take it away.
Sure thing. Thank you, Bill. So I think thanks again to the Kinder Institute for having me. And I think the way that we'll go through this process is I'm going to begin by talking about market urbanism. And then I'm going to talk about how market urbanism specifically applies to Houston, because free market urban policy and the city of Houston are very often linked, for better or worse. And I want to flesh through whether or not that idea and linkage is true or a myth. And then I think once we're done with that, Bill and I both agreed that having an extended Q&A would be good, just because we suspect that there are people who are not going to agree with the market urbanism position who might be in the audience, and feel free to fire away and talk about, and we can kind of debate and flesh through any agreeances or differences. So with that out of the way, let me share my presentation. So the name of the talk is What is Market Urbanism? And yeah, to elaborate on what Bill was saying, I'm a journalist who writes about national urban issues for Governing Magazine and a number of other magazines. If some people in the audience know about me, it might be because from 2015 to 2018, I did a big cross-country tour that was pretty well marketed, basically living in 30 different cities for a month each around the United States to get a sense of urban issues in the United States. And in the next year and a half, starting in July, I'm going to be doing the same type of trip around the world. I specifically want to study the urban issues in the global South. So be on the lookout for that trip upcoming. But yes, another thing is I own Market Urbanism Report. That is a media company that I started about 5 years ago. It really tapped into market urbanism was a larger movement, and there were other people talking about market urbanism before I started this. One comparison I would make it to is the YIMBY movement. There's not just any one YIMBY figurehead. If you're familiar with YIMBY policy, Yes in My Backyard, there are a lot of organizations talking about YIMBYism and a lot of different people. Market urbanism is kind of the same way. There's really thousands of people talking about market urbanism and who are interested in these issues. Market Urbanism Report was designed to really bring the movement together and talk about different issues that market urbanism might apply to. So what is market urbanism? It's a policy that applies free market economics to urban issues. So I would describe it as a study of classical liberalism. So when we think of classical liberals, we think of people like Frederick Hayek and Adam Smith, kind of the free market economic movement that really came about through the Enlightenment and the industrial era of the United States. So it's classical liberalism applied to free market issues. Another person that market urbanists have gotten inspiration from is Jane Jacobs, who in my mind applied the Hayekian free market critique down to the city planning level. And really, beyond just market urbanism being the use of classical liberalism for urban issues, I'd really say it's two different types of focuses. So the first one would be the idea of market urbanism as a theory. And when we talk about that, what we mean is, how would cities function if they did not have governments, if there was more privatization and they were effectively privately managed? And so you might call this anarcho-capitalism or extreme libertarianism. I call it a theory because it is very rarely used. Most big cities around the world are in fact run by governments, and they have municipal management and elected city councils. And really, this is distinct from, say, a privatized version would have cities run by boards of investors, or cities run by Web3 technology like DAOs. So I don't think this version of market urbanism is it might not pertain to this audience, but it is something that I have written about and thought about. And I think you are seeing it being tested on very small scales, which we can talk more about in the Q&A. There's a city called Prospero in Honduras that is supposed to be a private city, and it's just getting built right now. It would be an example of a private city. I think you can look at places like Dubai or Singapore or Hong Kong as embodying some of these private city experiments. But then on the other hand, really the second angle of market urbanism, which I think would pertain more to this audience, is market urbanism as a policy package. So not anarcho-capitalism, not full-fledged libertarianism, but suggesting certain policies that can be used in the existing urban context to kind of push in the libertarian or market urbanist direction and kind of get us there part of the way. but at the same time are politically likely, can be used in places like New York and San Francisco. So for this talk, I'll be focusing more on market urbanism as a pragmatic policy package as opposed to market urbanism theory. And there's really two angles that I like to talk about with market urbanism. One is housing and the other is transportation. So housing is the idea that the market urbanist position is the idea that housing can be located wherever the consumer demands it and can be built at the density and at the design and really perfectly matching consumer preferences as opposed to housing being built according to government plans. So what are some of the ways that market urbanism vision can be achieved? One of them is reforming zoning. And I would say the hardcore market urbanism position is that zoning in its current incarnation should be completely scrapped. If you look at the current zoning codes, they are often dictating not only use, but in some cases design, setbacks, positioning on the lot, height, density. And the market urbanist position is effectively that none of those laws are legitimate and that zoning as an institution needs to be scrapped and possibly replaced with what I would call market urbanism zoning, which I won't talk about in this specifically here, but if we want to go into detail in the Q&A, I can. But the short of market urbanism zoning is that we need to reimagine zoning as something that actually addresses actual externalities that people are concerned about from development, as opposed to just making random rules such as a setback has to be 25 feet, the DUA has to be 43, kind of getting away from the arbitrariness of existing zoning and getting to a more direct framework that talks about direct externalities and impacts. Another thing that market urbanists are very against is parking minimums. We think that the market, specifically the developer, should be able to build the amount of parking that they wish, and that if cities were to scrap parking minimums, housing would become cheaper and cities would become less auto-dependent. Building codes. This is a controversial one, but my position as a market urbanist is that government building codes do not need to exist. And the reason that I think that is that I believe that the private sector already has a number of actors within it that ensure that buildings will stay upright and be well managed and be safe. And so these actors that I'm thinking of are everyone from the investor to the financier to the developer to the end consumer who is actually living in the unit. They all have a collective interest in making sure that the building works and is staying upright. And so I think that government, and in fact, there are private sector building codes in place, such as the International Code Council, that ensure some of these things. So I think that having local or state building codes, in addition to that, are at very worst or at very best, they are duplicative. But I think at very worst, building codes become kind of this regulation that can be captured by special interests. And I'm thinking specifically union labor. Urban growth boundaries. So that's a very specific type of zoning that puts arbitrary lines around metro areas and says that developers can't build past a certain point. I'm against urban growth boundaries. I think that they artificially limit the supply of land and therefore the supply of housing as to drive prices up. But the type of zoning that I think from a market urbanist perspective, we're even more opposed to are ones that outlaw density. So I'm thinking height limits, limits to floor area ratio, dwelling units per acre. And if you think of the regulations that are probably the most costly and problematic in the United States, it's regulations like these that that are enforced on land right in the prime urban areas of major metros. So I'm thinking of like the zoning in San Francisco that only prevents certain type of development from happening, basically often single-story, single-unit buildings. And you're talking about some of the prime urban land in all of America and one of the prime job markets. And so those are very expensive regulations, and those are really more in the market urbanism crosshairs than any other type of regulation for cities. But I think above all, to wrap up the market urbanism take on housing, we're against really the whole architecture of planning and design review that has come to inflict cities. It's not any one regulation per se. It's the whole 9 yards. It's the fact that from the time that a developer issues a permit to the time they're actually able to break ground, they're often having to go through multiple bureaucracies, spend years through litigation and various bureaucratic hurdles, and they're often having to spend millions of dollars for the right to do it. So you're looking at certain fixed costs of the project that get passed down onto the consumer. And so really we're, even more than any specific regulation, we're against the whole infrastructure of red tape that prevents development from happening in cities. Now on to transportation. So a common pushback that I get from people when I talk about the market urbanism housing stance is they effectively say, if you let the market work, say in a place like Los Angeles, we agree that, yeah, you're going to get a lot of dense new development. If you Manhattanize Los Angeles, in other words, you're going to have a traffic nightmare, because already Los Angeles deals with a lot of traffic. And if you add a bunch of density and people don't really get out of their cars the way an urban planner might suspect they will, then you're going to have even worse gridlock than you do now. And so Market Urbanism, at Market Urbanism Report, I've set up a number of policies that I think can address that situation and effectively allow cities to become very dense, but also mitigate traffic in a market urbanist way, in a market-oriented way. And I think as we go through these, you might see some relation to Houston, because Houston is kind of in the same position where it's growing up. It's obviously grown out quite a lot, and it's growing up. And this city is going to have to learn to, in my opinion, adopt some of these policies. So the main one is road pricing, and I think that's key, because the very nature of road construction is road capacity is always going to be somewhat limited, because the process of like condemning a bunch of property and expanding roads is just very politically and financially difficult. And so the market urbanist answer to that is you need to price the existing roads so that it's reflecting the demand of people using them. And I'm thinking specifically of dynamic pricing, where the price increases at certain peak times, morning and evening, and then the price goes down as the day goes by and you have less crowded times. That has the effect of dispersing demand. So a lot of the congestion that people talk about, dynamic road pricing is designed to address that. I think another benefit of road pricing is that it encourages more than just single occupancy driving. And so I'm going to get to that in a second, but basically there's a whole nascent, rather than carpooling being out of fashion, I think there's a whole nascent industry, and I'm thinking particularly of like car share and ride pool, like Uber. There's a whole nascent industry of companies that want to provide that service. And if you have dynamic road pricing, those companies are going to be able to outbid a single occupancy driver for precious road space or express lanes. So that's kind of the market idea behind that is, if in a situation of lack of supply and scarcity of roads, we need to price them based on demand. Another big market urbanism initiative is public transit reform. This is more of a legacy city thing, although I think it could apply to Houston as well. Basically, a lot of agencies like SEPTA and New York MTA are less interested actually in having good transit and moving people around than they are in becoming sort of these patronage mills that employ a lot of union labor and run up costs. And so public transit reform is very much on the market urbanism agenda. We're not necessarily against public transit, but we think that bringing private sector principles such as outsourcing and various privatization and various other legal reforms will help. We want public transit systems to run more like businesses and to bring in the cost cutting and the efficiency that a business has. But on the flip side, in addition to public transit, I think that private transit can very much complement it. And again, maybe not so much in Houston, but I think in some of the denser cities, there is very much of a pent-up demand for private transit operators to operate in those cities. You especially see it if you travel. Like, for example, if you go to many Latin American cities, they'll often have big private bus networks to compete with and complement the private transit system, and in fact, or public transit system. And in fact, they're quite essential in moving many people around. But in the United States, that is banned. There have been any number of companies that have tried to operate private buses in say, New York and San Francisco, and they either work in the shadows or they're outlawed altogether. Market-based right-of-way. This is another big one for dense cities in particular. And particularly I'm talking about road pricing would be an example, but also I'm talking about curb space pricing. So getting to this idea of rather than giving a bunch of your precious curb space in your commercial areas for parking or for underpriced parking, bring market signals into the process. And I think if you were to have a market bidding process, you would begin to see other uses for curb space besides just parking. A lot of are looking to bring more outdoor seating for restaurants. So for example, in a market-based bidding process, if a restaurant wants to pay more to have expanded outdoor seating along the curb in front of the restaurant, and it's willing to pay more than, say, a solo driver wishing to park, then they should be able to win that bid. And whereas I think in a lot of cases in big cities, mayors run the curb space and the local DOTs just have this month that curb space has to be used for parking. I say open up the market for this. So include free market policy and urban issues rooted from the classical liberal tradition. Really at bottom with urbanism, theory, more than just being a set of best practices, we're really trying to make a statement about working in interests should be able to play in helping to build a city rather than having top-down government bureaucracy side things. My housing stance, which is, do we really need a central planning bureaucracy to zone an entire city, or should we allow to have millions of different preferences to buy the type of housing where and how they want and where they want to live? Should we really have transit by the government that control everywhere and how people move, or should we have a number of different entrepreneurs getting people around based on consumer preference? Really is focused on individual rights as opposed to kind of top-down government management that experts for a number of people know how to decide the best interests for millions of people. And if you want to learn about these issues, I just wrote a book about them. So yeah, now that we know what market urbanism is, so I get this a lot because when I talk about having a city with no zoning and minimal regulation, they say people who are suspicious of this idea will say, well, we're going to get a bunch of Houstons then. Does everybody really want a bunch more Houstons? And I would actually argue that, yes, we do want a bunch more Houstons, but the issue is more complicated than that. And I really want to flesh through that because I think in some way Houston does resemble market urbanism, and in some ways it is the complete opposite of market urbanism. And that ultimately reflects its what its destiny is and its ability to solve certain problems. So, in what respect is Houston market urbanist? I would say that its zoning light model is probably a closer embodiment of market urbanism than any other city in the United States. And so that really says a lot about other cities because they're not, most cities are in fact regulated and government run like I established, and they don't really reflect market urbanism. I would say Houston comes the closest, and it's due to the zoning light. I'm not going to say that it's completely unzoned because Houston does have certain regulations that I think would be called zoning in other cities, but it's the closest thing to the unregulated model. So no regulation of use, less limits on density than most cities, no parking minimums, at least downtown. Another example of how I think Metro Houston, and here I'm not talking about the city, but really the suburban areas, reflects market urbanism, and that would be MUDs, or municipal utility districts. And that is a photo of the Woodlands just north of Houston, which is, I want to say, the largest private city in the entire United States. So MUDs are pretty much that. I would view them as a close resemblance of the private city model. And basically, if a developer, the way they happen is a developer assembles land, they form a municipal utility district, and they float bonds and kind of do the normal development process of using the bond money to build the infrastructure. When they start to build the houses, they do collect a fee from the people living in the houses, and that's used to pay off the bonds. So it is typical of how a government-run city would work, but in my mind, MUDs allow more autonomy than a specific city would typically allow. It's also more, there's less of a democratic process, I would say, in MUDs than in a typical city. So for example, if a board of investors wants to start a city, they can actually control and take reign of the city. Whereas in a normal one, you would have raw democracy, elected councils, people voting, so on and so forth. And so I view it as a good privatization model because it really allows the people investing in the city who have a stake in how it's going to do, being able to set things like housing policy and the local regulatory code and how the streets are laid out, and so on and so forth. And so Bill and I were talking about this, just how my problem though with MUDs is that, so several hundred of them have been formed in Texas, and most of them are in the suburban Houston area. And while you have this really creative model, I would not say that MUDs have been used particularly creatively. Oftentimes they are used for just building your typical suburban HOA tract housing type development. Where I like MUDs though, and where I think it fits the market urbanism model, is if you do want to become a developer who goes and builds a new city with really, with a traditional street grid and really dense construction, and sort of like, if you're wanting to go in and build a new Singapore in the United States, or what have you, something that better reflects the traditional urban model, I would look at MUDs as possibly the best tool in all of the United States to be able to do something like that. Because you can form a MUD in Texas, you can assemble raw land, and you can build the city as you wish to build it, and based on the market preferences of the people that you were building for. So it's something that, it's a legal avenue that in my mind brings a lot more autonomy than trying to build in an existing city in the United States. That said, in what ways does Houston not reflect the market urbanism model? And so we have to look at that too, because a lot of the criticisms about Houston being that it has a lot of sprawl and it has a lot of traffic, in my mind, have to do with the fact that it actually is not fully market urbanist. And so a lot of the regulations that make it, a lot of the things that make Houston function like any other American city are because it has regulations like other American cities. So the first one would be deed restrictions. And you might argue that the deed restrictions should have gone over into the yes section of being market oriented. I will say that deed restrictions, which cover, I want to say, about a fourth of the city, they're more market oriented, I would say, than your average zoning code. In this sense, most cities have a zoning code that covers the entire city. In Houston, they do it a little bit more incrementally. If you're of the NIMBY mindset and you don't want a lot of development in your neighborhood, you can go live in a deed, which covers a fraction of the city. So that way, it's sort of a policy that benefits everybody in their different preferences. If you want stagnation, if you want minimal growth and change in your neighborhood, go live in a deeded neighborhood. If you don't want that, live outside a deeded neighborhood. And in that case, you're living in a Houston area with more chaos and more change. Houston still has lot size and setback regulations, and Houston still has historic preservation districts. What Houston also has is, and that reflects sort of the more top-down, less market urbanist model, is it has socialized transport policy. And I'm thinking here particularly of roads. So when critics look at Houston and they say, well, it's market oriented and as a result it has all kinds of sprawl, I would say, no, back up. I mean, I think a lot of the reason that it has a lot of sprawl is because it has a socialized road system that uses a lot of eminent domain policy to build roads, and then it does not properly charge for those roads. So yeah, if you build a bunch of free roads out into the peripheries, you will get a lot of sprawl. But that does not necessarily mean that the sprawl is a market outcome, because it's sort of like the cost of the road construction and so forth have been socialized, and it becomes kind of a tragedy of the commons. So I would look at the I-45 as being one example. It does have some fees for usage, but I mean, basically, the act of trying to expand that road by having a bunch of eminent domain and road widenings, and you're not even like paying the extra. It's not like people are even forced to pay the externalities that the road creates. I don't view that as a market process. That's a socialized process. So in conclusion, I think that the aspects of Houston that people like, which would really be the affordability, the dynamic job market. Well, I'll say this, the aspects that they like, which at bottom are the fact that it's not only an opportunity city that has really good jobs, but it's one that has also managed to remain affordable, which that's a pretty rare combination. I mean, there's a lot of metros that have really good job markets like New York and San Francisco, but they have not remained affordable. So a certain class of people cannot participate in the economy. The best thing about Houston is that it combines affordability with opportunity. And that, I think, is a result of its market processes and the fact that it is less regulated and it allows more housing. And that's what I'm really getting to in this chart, which is that for several years now, I've studied the Census Bureau permit numbers for what I call 20 superstar metros. And you'll see there I have the whole gamut. The superstar East Coast cities, the West Coast cities, and then a lot of the fast growing ones in the Sun Belt. What I find is that the cities that permit the most housing have the lowest prices, as you can clearly see from that graph. And Houston may well be the best performer on the entire graph in the sense that its home prices are lower than any of the other quote unquote superstar metros, and its permits are extremely high. And I don't think those things are an accident. Like they're correlated, and I would say one caused the other. So Houston very often leads the nation in net total permits, and its permitting rate is right up there with some of the top metros in the country. And as you can see, it has extremely low prices. So that relatively market aspect of Houston, in my mind, explains why it has become the city that it has and become this affordable city. On the other hand, the aspects of Houston that people do not like, meaning the sprawl and the congestion and the pollution, are a result of where the city has not embraced market policy and has instead embraced the more socialized policy. And I'm thinking particularly the road situation of basically just taking a bunch of federal and state money, building a lot of new roads, not necessarily charging market clearing prices for them. And so, alas, you get a tragedy of the commons. So that's pretty much my conclusion. And it's really the one thing I would want everyone to take away is that the good aspects of Houston, in my mind, are the ways in which it embodies market urbanism. The bad aspects of Houston are the ways in which it embodies generic American top-down planning.
Thank you, Scott. You certainly give us a lot to think about. Let's unpack a few of these things. Let's begin, I think, by talking about, you said you didn't want to go into detail in market urbanism zoning, but I actually think the audience would be pretty interested in that. What aspects of zoning should remain? What aspects should be eliminated? And are there new things that you should consider? What does market urbanism zoning look like?
Sure. So I write about it a lot in my book and have written several detailed articles about it for different publications. But here is basically how I would see it playing out. I think step one is for a city to write a nuisance code that people can generally agree on. So we don't want noise, we don't want pollution, we don't want runoff. And then where the market urbanism code would come in is effectively say, all development is allowed by right as long as it does not violate the nuisance code. Okay. And so and if it does, and really step three there is if it does violate a nuisance code, there is a negotiation process that the developer can do with surrounding affected parties that either prevents the development from not happening or allows them to actually bargain for the ability to do their development as long as the parties are satisfied. And so this is different from a traditional Euclidean zoning, because a traditional Euclidean zoning bans things outright. If you want to open a bar in a residential area, you can't do that point blank in a Euclidean code. You can do it in a market urbanism code, and it would be a negotiation by which it occurs. So say that people are concerned about the noise that the bar will produce. if you have a code determining maximum decibel levels, then the bar can be constructed in such a way that it puts noise canceling insulation in there, or it basically internalizes the externality in some way that will prevent the bar from breaking the code. On the other hand, if the bar cannot meet the decibel code, what it can still do is it can negotiate with the surrounding neighbors, possibly pay them. This is called Cosian Bargaining. And it's an economic concept that basically says negotiate with money for the affected parties. So if the surrounding neighborhoods don't want the noise and the bar offers them, say, $500 a year for tolerating the noise, and they come to that agreement, then the bar can go through. Now, whether or not that happens in real life, it's market urbanism zoning is making the basic point that things should be allowed by right. And when or if those things begin to cause impacts or externalities, there is a kind of an economic process by which the development can still happen as opposed to being banned.
We are in an era where zoning is being rethought. Do you see any cities moving in the direction you described, where you have to internalize the externalities rather than simply have a yes or no on a particular use?
Unfortunately not. I mean, I think if people would kind of like define this as spot zoning, they would think that it's too arbitrary, or that it's trying to give privileges to specific parcels. Probably the best thing that I've seen would be a form-based code that replaces the Euclidean, because at least then you're being more permissive and you're regulating more on the aesthetics of a project as opposed to the density and the use. But even then, I view both Euclidean and form-based as kind of this normative process. It's taking random numbers off of a page and saying a development has to meet these metrics, but the metrics never quite make sense to me. I mean, it's kind of like if the setback is, say a city has a universal setback in its residential neighborhoods of 25 feet. Well, how did they arrive at 25 feet? And like, what is the stated purpose of the setback? What exactly is the setback trying to prevent? I think if you went into downtown Houston and asked 100 random people what they thought the purpose of the city's setbacks were, assuming they even know about the law, you'd probably get 100 different answers, because it's not evident what the point of those laws are and why the specific numbers were chosen. Market urbanism zoning would not be about choosing specific numbers. It would be about allowing things and then kind of like getting into the meat of what really bothers people in the given area and how that can be absolved.
Okay. Again, if you have a question, please, we have a few questions that I'm going to get to in a minute. Please put them in the Q&A box. And if you like a question, you can move it up. I wanted to go back, Scott, and talk a little about private cities. You held up the Woodlands as maybe the closest thing we see in the US to a private city. I think is probably what you were saying. And you several times you said, I want to ask you a couple questions about this. Well, first of all, maybe you can tell us about the more private cities that you've seen around the world. You mentioned the one in Honduras that is under construction. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the characteristics of those are and how they're different even from the woodlands or places that we see in the United States.
Yeah, I think they're quite different, especially if we want to use the Honduran example. And of course, that has not been built yet. It's in the planning process, and I'm going to go see it when I go through Honduras this year. But basically, that's called a ZED, which is roughly Spanish for special economic zone. And the idea is that a bunch of investors from Europe bought island property in Roatan which is off the coast from mainland Honduras. And they are contracting with the Honduran government to basically just leave them alone. The agreement is, we are going to pay you a certain, we are going to pay the Honduran government a certain stipend. And in response, and in exchange, you are going to allow us autonomy to develop this island the way that we want. And the kind of the social contract that they are offering to people is, Honduras is one of the most dangerous countries in the whole world. If you want to live in a place that's safe and that is economically prosperous and does not have all the grease palming and the red tape involved in starting a business in Honduras, come move to this island. And so yeah, it's kind of like, it's a Latin American free enterprise zone, or you might say it's like they're attempting to be the Singapore of Latin America. But really, I think the philosophical point being made there is that rather than having these big states that are big and powerful, have a number of little microzones that are more experimental and that where you can try different models of governance.
You've said several times, you've used the term board of investors several times when you've talked about a private city, rather than having an elected set of politicians running a city. You have a board of investors. When you say board of investors, who exactly do you mean? Well, who does that include? Who does it exclude? And how would it be different than a sort of a typical political process?
Well, there's a number of directions I could go. I mean, some of them would be, my answer might seem esoteric in some cases, but if you imagine a city being run the same way a publicly traded corporation is, you do have a lot of board in a publicly traded corporation. The board seats and the power that a given board member has is owing to oftentimes to the number of shares they have in the company. So I mean, you know, when I say board of investors, I mean very well-heeled people who have put a lot of money into a city and now have voting power commensurate with the amount of shares that they bought. But also, the board of investors model could just be more of a crowdfunding model where, say, and I think the Honduran city is going to be doing this, where say thousands of people buy shares in the company, or even millions of people, and then they have voting rights based on those shares. So it's kind of like with a publicly traded company. If Pepsi wanted to oust its CEO, they would issue that. They may, in some cases, issue that vote up to the shareholders, and that's what I'm viewing for cities. And the reason that would be different than democracy, and in my mind better than democracy, is that it prevents some of the freeloader problems that I view as being innate to democracy, where people who have not really bought into the city or bought into the system and who don't really pay into the system nonetheless have democratic say, and they vote for things that may benefit them in sort of a special interest way, but that aren't good for the overall city. Whereas I think it raises
another question I wanted to ask, which is, I guess, so I'm going to ask two questions which are kind of intermingled, and I'm sorry about that. But the question I was going to ask you was, even in a private city, are there public goods, and if so, how do you provide them? But related to that is the question of how do you ensure that the investors themselves do not do the same thing that you just as the freeloader problem, which is how do you make sure they're not just a special interest looking out for themselves?
Well, I think in the case of a private city that has a board of investors, the incentives are ultimately aligned towards profit. And you might think of, I mean, a real estate investment trust has a similar dynamic, what is more popularly called REITs, which is everybody wants the city to be profitable. Everybody wants the real estate being developed to be very high yielding. So the theory, at least, is that if that's the goal that everybody is driving towards, then having the board of investors weigh in and make the decisions are going to push people in that direction.
Okay, let's move to some of the questions from the audience now. The first question we have comes from Luis Fajardo, who is the Urban Research Policy Manager at the Kinder Institute and very familiar with Latin American cities. He notes that many of the Latin American cities with private transit have chaotic and uncoordinated transit services. The buses are in poor shape, spew lots of emissions, and don't hold drivers accountable for dangerous driving behaviors. I'll skip over it, but how would the market urbanist approach deal with that reality, which he has observed on the ground in Latin American cities?
Yeah, and that is true. I mean, that's been, I know Peceros in Mexico City, that has been the criticism, and they're actually trying to reduce their Pecero bus network from 26,000 down to 15,000 or whatever it is. But I don't know, it kind of goes back to the nuisance code that I was talking about with housing, which is that, market urbanism and libertarianism is not antithetical to having laws, especially when you're talking about laws that are meant to address externalities. So, I mean, if I think, like, for example, the issue of fighting over curb space that happens between private buses, I think you begin to solve that if you have laws dictating how the curb is supposed to be used, and ideally even have market bidding for the curb space, so that a bus company could buy potential curb space in the city. And I think it's the case with any city is that you have to have laws to prevent the externalities and
maybe Scott, would you mind? You're kind of fading in and out, and we're getting a little. Maybe could you turn your video off for a couple minutes and just so we can get the sound a little bit better? We're having a little. I think you're having a little internet problem there. I'm sorry to do that, but because we want to see you, but I think hearing you is probably just as important. You ready to move on to the next question?
I am.
Okay. I'll just read this one. Another transport model to consider is Shanghai and Tokyo. Transit is commonly privatized, and land use is tied to the transport. Where the service is built, the land use is intensified. But in the US, we subsidize land uses that take advantage of transport, but don't sustain the cost of high transit service. Would your model account for charging for transport services, but allowing the land use to change where the services are deployed? And I think what the essence here is, we often make transportation investments and in fact transit investments, but we do not permit the market to provide equally high, appropriately high density development. How do you, in the US system, how do you get around that problem?
Yeah, that's describing value capture, which I've written about a lot and bring up a lot of examples in my book. I think you mentioned Tokyo, but another example would be Hong Kong. MTR, which, by the way, that's a partially private, partially public system, has in fact bought a lot of the land around their system. And so it becomes this sort of recycled value capture mechanism where they build really densely along the land. That obviously adds more customers and revenue for the system. And then when the system is good in hand, that increases the value of the development. So it's sort of this recycled value capture process. Brightline in Florida is trying to do that. That's a higher speed rail that is being built from Miami up through the urbanized spine of Florida. And they're building a number of towers around their stations to try to capture that. But the problem, and this kind of gets back to my larger theory about governments not really running things well or running things with profit incentive in mind, is that when you look at something like SF BART or New York MTA, they do in fact own a lot of the land around their stations, but they don't have that incentive, or in some cases, they don't have the political ability to build densely around the land. And so we are missing huge gains to the potential transit systems in this country as a result of that.
I wanted to ask you another, speaking of the transportation system, I wanted to ask you another question about that, which is, you've described using essentially congestion pricing as a tool, which is something that some people are for and some people are against. The way we tend to toll highways in the United States, and especially in Texas, is we don't toll the congestion, we toll the construction of new highways. Right, and I think it might even be illegal in Texas to do what you describe. So, for example, in Austin now, there is a tolled bypass for I-35 through downtown, but I-35 through downtown is free, and now we're talking about expanding it to 20 lanes. What thoughts do you have about overcoming the political obstacles associated with this kind of philosophy of tolling for new construction rather than tolling for congestion?
Well, I'm not opposed to either strategy, and in fact, I would say that Texas has better road policy than any other state in the country, just because it does have a lot of toll roads. Like, people in Texas recognize that there is a lot of growth and that they apparently need new roads. And so you have, like the one in Austin, like State Highway 130 that goes up
right
through Central Texas. Like, yeah, you're having new roads built, and fortunately they pay for themselves or come close because they are tolled. But what I would add is that, yes, you also want to toll the existing roads. I think that for something like I-35 or I-45, it really doesn't make sense to expand the width of the roads, which just brings all kinds of, like, there's so much money and really just ill will coming from road expansions, because you're having to widen them into people's neighborhoods and condemn their homes. Why take the extreme measure of doing that when you can just toll the existing lanes? And you might find in the process of tolling those lanes that you don't even need the added capacity.
Okay. I want to go back. Speaking of Austin, there's another question about Austin based on your last chart, which is very interesting. And I want to amplify the question. The question is, could you comment on the high housing permit? I think the point is, Austin has a restrictive zoning and permitting processes and significantly higher home prices, yet it's still building more per capita than any other American metro. So let me turn this question around a little bit. Even today and over the last 15 or 20 years, as your chart shows, Austin has built more housing per capita than any other metro in the country. Yet what we are now seeing is that housing prices are going through the roof there. Can you comment on why that might be, or is there a different solution required in a situation like that?
Yeah, and that is 100% true. Austin has, by a long shot, beaten every other metro in per capita home permits, yet it has still become sort of this model it's become kind of the storyline there is that the home prices are going up quite a lot. And so people view this as kind of a rebuttal for the YIMBY narrative of, hey, you do have this metro that built a lot and it's still really expensive. So what I think that teaches us a couple things. One is that the market may not completely solve this problem, and that Austin might actually make an argument for, you do need some subsidy in some cases to provide for the lower income, like the lower side of the income scale. And that can come through any number of things. I mean, I think that LIHTC is a fairly good program for initiating new housing construction that's affordable.
That's the low-income housing tax credit.
Yeah, low-income housing tax credit. Obviously, homeless grants for homeless housing, which come from HUD. I think it's an argument for Section 8. It's an argument for any number of things. That said, I think the issue is a little bit more complicated, because when you look at where the permitting activity actually takes place in Metro Austin, the city itself is still quite restrictive and has a lot of restrictive zoning. And so that's why the city itself is quite expensive. Whereas if you go, say, to the northern suburbs like Pflugerville or Round Rock, you're actually seeing relatively affordable. You're seeing a lot of permitting up there, a lot of new condo projects and everything, and you're seeing relatively stable pricing. I mean, I think if you go on Zillow right now and go to Pflugerville, you're going to see a lot of like 1950s ranch homes that are selling in the high 200s, low 300,000s. You're even going to see new homes that are selling for under the US median sales price right now. So that tells me that in the parts of the metro where they actually are building, you're seeing somewhat of the filtering process of older housing becoming, not so expensive, and you're seeing a little bit more affordability in those places.
We have time for about one more question, so I'm going to vamp off of Vanessa Cole's question, which is something I think is on everyone's mind. I think a lot of people in our audience and a lot of people involved in urban planning would argue that a market urbanism approach might actually disadvantage low and moderate income communities by favoring market and above communities. But I'm guessing you think that in fact a market urbanism approach would open up opportunities for low and moderate income neighborhoods, and I'm wondering how you foresee that occurring.
Well, I think that if you look at a gentrifying neighborhood in a hot city, so say Harlem in New York City, or you could talk about the Mission District in San Francisco, I don't think that, first off, those neighborhoods are susceptible to the larger demand pressures going on in the entire city. They're not vacuums, they're not on an island. And people who are suspicious of market urbanism would have to ask, does not building throughout the entire city magically make Harlem and the Mission more affordable? And I'm going to say no, that if we accept as a constant that people want to move to New York and San Francisco, and new housing is not getting built in the neighborhoods that they want to live in, some of them are naturally going to gravitate and speculate in Harlem and the Mission. And so the market urbanism premise is really saying you need to build very densely in the neighborhoods that people most want to live in, and that will add to housing supply, and ultimately it will house well-heeled people who will not otherwise move into the gentrifying neighborhoods and inflate the prices there. So really, it's an economic argument called filtering, which is the idea that if you build a lot of new housing in market rates and people snap them up, it causes a natural depreciation for the older housing, and it prevents them from filtering upward, which would be becoming more expensive even as they get older.
Do you think I think a lot of people would say we've underproduced housing in the United States for decades, and that is preventing filtering from occurring, which is part of the reason why prices are going up. Would you agree with that?
100%.
Okay.
I mean, we have an estimated 3.5 million shortage of single family homes. And if you throw multifamily in there, you're probably up to 4 or 5 million unit shortage. And that's why you're seeing, I mean, the whole idea that homes should be investments and should appreciate in price over time is, in my mind, flawed. And the fact that people have come to expect that to happen is really a statement on our inventory shortage.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Scott Beyer, thanks very much for being with us today and bringing us the market urbanism perspective. And thanks for your insights, particularly on Houston. I know Houston was one of the cities you lived in for a month, and you gained a lot of insights from that. Really appreciate you being with us today. And thank you for everyone who joined us in the audience today. We have one more webinar before the before the summer break. On June 22nd, we will host a webinar, I believe it's at 10 a.m., to share highlights from the Kinder Institute's third annual State of Housing in Houston and Harris County report. This year's report will be the first to capture the pandemic's impact on the local housing market. I'll give you a hint of what it says. It says that prices are going up. A panel discussion on affordable housing challenges will follow. You can register for the upcoming event by visiting kinder.rice.edu or by scanning the QR code on the screen to visit our website. Thanks very much. Thanks again to Scott. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.